families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Families Divided TV. In this episode, you're going to be hearing from Bill Eddy, and he's going to be speaking on confirmation bias in family court. Family court judges handle a lot of cases, some up to 3,000 cases per year. They have to make a lot of decisions quickly. This means they often form their impression of a case based on the first allegations of bad behavior and then focus on what to do about it. In addition, they may have an unconscious belief that certain allegations are usually true or are usually not true. Confirmation bias is a scientific term for having one theory of a problem and then proving it to yourself by only investigating that theory and missing all the other evidence which may disprove that theory. Since alienation has been slow to be understood and accepted in family courts, this means that many judges have a confirmation bias against it and don't look equally at evidence of alienation when there are allegations of abuse. This episode will explain this problem and what can be done about it by parents and professionals. We're going to also hear from attorney Chris Smith. He's going to be speaking to us about what he's going to be presenting at our upcoming fall conference in October, and it's titled Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and the Abuse. Bill Eddy will also be one of our guest presenters there as well. This conference is absolutely the most important and chock-filled information and other things happening events that we've ever had with Family Access fighting for children's rights. Many have already registered. I hope you'll register. This is not only for family members that are alienated, it's also much too for those who are professionals who work in the field of alienation. This starts on Friday night and it runs through Sunday night. It's going to be filled totally with lots of different things and events. I do hope you'll join us. The information about everything going on is on our website at familyaccess.info, or I've done a video on our YouTube channel in reference to it as well. So please take the time and view that, and please join this event. Nothing is more important than understanding, if you're in alienation, about the trauma and the abuse. So please take time and be with us. We're going to be with you in just a moment with Bill Eddy and also with Chris Smith right after these messages.
Sadly, too many know the pain and trauma associated with parental and grandparent alienation. Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, will present an important international virtual conference on October the 13th through the 15th, 2023. The conference, entitled Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse, will feature world-renowned experts in the field of alienation. You'll join the conference event coordinator, Elaine Cobb, and moderator, Megan Hunter, as they introduce you to keynote speaker, Dr. Edward Kruk. Plus, you'll hear important presentations from Dr. Joshua Coleman, Lisa Rothfuss, Dr. Mary Alvarez, Chris Smith, Bill Eddy, Dr. Noel Hunter, Dr. Sue Kornblum, Dr. William Burnett, Megan Hunter, and Jordan Traeger. Join the many attendees already securing their spot for the conference entitled Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse. For information, visit familyaccess.info for all the details. The special conference is being hosted by Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, Steel Partners Foundation, and PASCA, Parental Alienation is Child Abuse.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. Parents learn to use our popular BIF and EAR skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
This program is going to focus on the subject of confirmation bias, which is a concept that people often don't think about, but it hugely impacts their lives. And especially if you're dealing with an alienation situation that's not being understood by other people, especially professionals, what you might be witnessing is confirmation bias. So I'm going to talk about confirmation bias in family courts. And the idea is that confirmation bias occurs when a decision maker or an investigator or someone that's around a situation where there's a problem only has one theory of that problem. In other words, this is a case of abuse, for example, of physical child abuse, and they think that's what's going on, and they jump to that conclusion. And in many ways, confirmation bias is a fancy term for jumping to conclusions that may be wrong. So what happens is an investigator or decision maker has this one theory, and when they have one theory, they focus on information that reinforces that theory, even though it may be very minor or really misinformed. They often disregard information that would conflict with the theory, that would go with an alternate theory, and they misinterpret vague information to fit their theory. So if we think about this as a case that looks like physical child abuse on the surface, but it's really alienation, if the decision maker jumps to the conclusion it's physical child abuse, then everything they hear and see, they'll interpret that way and often confirm that theory to themselves, even when it's wrong. So if you think of this in the big picture, not just judges or mediators or evaluators, but just people in general and people interviewing to find out what's going on, like testimony in court or someone interviewing a child, that having one theory influences the interview. So I became a family lawyer in 1993 after 12 years as a family therapist from 1980. And I learned a lot about child abuse. I worked with children and families as a licensed clinical social worker. And so I also learned about alienation because we really became aware of that in the 1980s. That's when it really started getting discussed. And so in 1993, when I became a family lawyer, I started being responsible for cases in family court. And by 1995, I was getting cases that had allegations, for example, of child sexual abuse. And what I learned about that, and I did a survey of family lawyers, had 120 family lawyers respond in San Diego County. And about that is we found that about a third of allegations of child sexual abuse were true. And I had some cases like that, including 2 cases where men went to jail because of child sexual abuse that I totally believe was true. Police were involved in investigating it, and those were true cases. And child sexual abuse is a terrible thing. And it's something that we have to recognize is underreported in society. But on the other hand, my survey showed that people thought that 2/3 of allegations of child sexual abuse were not true. About half of those were honestly believed, where a parent believed that the other parent had sexually abused the child. And about 1/3 of those were where it was knowingly false. And I had those cases. I even got court sanctions against a parent for false allegations of child sexual abuse, which had just become part of the law in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And what was happening in those false allegations cases was they were really alienation cases. And so this was something that was happening in society in the 1990s. There were child care center workers going to prison for 40 years and things like that because of child sexual abuse allegations. But what they found is that these were cases of confirmation bias, that the interviewers, many of whom were social workers or police, had a theory of the case that it was true. And so they would interview a child and say, now you have to tell us the truth. And if you tell us the truth, then you can go home. And what was happening is children were making up these terrible stories against child care center workers, Sunday school teachers, all of this that weren't true. And slowly this got figured out. And in 1995, a book was published about how to do proper interviews to avoid confirmation bias. So what they found is basically children and adults want to please people, and so they tell interviewers what they think they want to hear. That because they're authority figures in charge of figuring things out, they figure out what the person wants to hear and say, yeah, that's what happened, when it's not what's true. So investigators with one theory inappropriately ask leading questions. What were you wearing when your father touched your privates or something like that? Well, so a child who wants to go home figures out the person wants me to say something. So I'm going to say, I was wearing my, my cowboy pants, or I was just wearing my underwear, something like that. But the interviewer got it wrong. And so with leading questions like this, and by the way, this is 1990s, so there's been much improvement and you don't hear as much about this, but there's still allegations of child sexual abuse that often are actually alienation cases. So I'm going to mention child sexual abuse. I'm going to mention domestic violence. These are true problems, but they also get confused with alienation. And so if you're going to court, you need to know that and make sure that this is considered as one of the possibilities, that this is alienation and not child abuse or something else. And what happens when an interviewer and decision maker just has one point of view is that the people with the other point of view are afraid to speak up. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is the confusion when there's one theory. So as an example, child refuses to see dad. And grandparents, everybody on that side of the family. And so the professional that's looking into it could be a judge taking testimony, could be psychologists looking into it, could be just lawyer or mediator that's trying to understand, maybe even a therapist. And so they may focus on information. The first theory that's put out there is that, well, dad must have abused the child. The child resists seeing dad because of that. And the child's angry at dad. And the child says, Dad ruined my life. Dad's controlling. Dad pulls my hair. Dad shoved me down once and I fell down. And so, well, sounds like a case of child abuse, doesn't it? Well, they may disregard information or not even look for it that doesn't fit that theory. So maybe mom repeatedly tells the child that dad caused the divorce, that dad's a mean person, that dad hit her once when the child was 1 year old. And maybe the child's 8 or 9 now, or 12 or 13. And that's their only source of information because they've resisted seeing dad. And mom, in this case, is emotionally intensely invested in saying that dad's terrible. So it looks like it's an abuse case. And in many cases, family court judges have a lot of cases, so they're quick to decide, okay, well, so this is a child abuse case, what should be done? Rather than, is this a child abuse case? And that's where people need to speak up and say, there's another problem, there's a different problem going on here, and that's alienation. So let's look at this case. If the investigator, whether it's a mental health professional, judge, etc., asked more detailed questions. So the child's angry at dad. So why are you angry at dad? Well, he embarrasses me by the way he wears his hair. Oh, okay. Anything else? Well, he didn't show up to pick me up once for take me to karate or something like that. And so you start, oh, well, these aren't reasons that a child would want to end a relationship with a parent. These are the kind of reasons that the alienation looks like. And the 5-factor model looks at it. There's things like this that just don't fit the situation. Child says ruined his life. So, well, let's ask about that. So how did your dad ruin your life? Well, because he wanted the divorce. We have to live in 2 houses and I don't get to see my friends as often. Well, that's true in all divorce cases. And yet, most divorce cases don't have alienation as an issue. Alienation occurs, 10 to 15% of the time. Was the statistics 20 years ago, it may be 20% now. We're seeing and hearing about an increase in alienation, even at the same time that there's getting to be more knowledge about it. So if you ask more questions, say, well, how's your dad controlling? Well, he wouldn't let me go on this trip with my friend to Switzerland. Well, that's a hugely expensive trip. And, I don't have the money for that. I can't afford that. But let's go to the museum. Let's go to the park. Let's go to the beach. Let's go, visit your grandparents. Let's do other things. But somehow the word controlling got in there. And I have to tell you, I've never heard a child on their own say that a parent was controlling. That's a word that usually comes from parents. So you say your dad pulled your hair. Tell me more about that. What was happening? Well, he was cutting my hair and pulled on it. And how old were you when he was cutting your hair and that happened? Oh, I was 5 years old. Well, now you're 12 years old. I mean, how many times has he cut your hair since then? Oh, he doesn't cut it since then. He realized he's not very good at it. Okay, so now we've got someone who's embarrassed because his father wears his hair some way, who lives in 2 houses, said no to an expensive trip, and pulled his hair when he was cutting his hair, not an intentional abuse or anything like that. But tell me, so he shoved you and you fell down. Tell me more what was happening. Well, we were out and playing in the snow. And at one point he pushed me, I fell down. Oh, you were playing? Well, yeah, we were playing, but I pushed him and he's bigger than I am, so that wouldn't have bothered him, but he pushed me back and I fell down in the snow. Oh, did you get any bruises from that? Well, no, not really, but I didn't like it. Oh, okay. So now you start seeing there's all these kind of disproportionate reasons for resisting the parent. Now let's find out about what mom's doing. So does mom talk to you about dad? Yeah, mom's pretty upset about dad. She doesn't like dad. Oh, okay. And so you find out that mom is constantly telling the child, the son, negative things about dad, repeating different phrases, including he's too controlling. Well, that's where that word came from. And doesn't set limits. Maybe mom is the favored 100%, everything mom does is fine. And everything dad does is terrible. And it's interesting, if you ask a child, can you think of a single positive thing about the rejected parent? By the way, I'm using dad as an example. This is very much going to apply to mom. And I'll mention a couple other examples like that. But it's this 100% negative that's characteristic of alienation. Even abused kids usually don't reject a parent. They just don't want the abuse. So in understanding alienation, you start seeing it looks like abuse on the surface in many cases, but it's actually alienation. You always have to look beneath the surface, can't jump to conclusions. And if you have a friend or family member dealing with this, keep an open mind. So you realize this is a possibility. Alienation is happening a lot these days. So anyway, so mom, schedules events during dad's time. Doesn't tell dad about doctor's appointments, doesn't set limits, lets the child just, decide when he wants to go to bed, doesn't necessarily get his homework all done, just kind of lets things go. Well, now you start seeing child's favoring mom because she, makes life, real easy and fun. And she says all these negative things about dad. So why see dad? Just hang out with mom and everything's fun and happy. And so the child really absorbs this, all or nothing view of both parents. So mom's all good, dad has nothing good. And so you start realizing this is alienation, but you have to ask questions. You have to go beneath the surface. And frankly, I'm seeing this as a problem these days. I do a lot of consultation on high conflict cases, including court cases. And what's happening, I see some of the worst cases I get is that there was never been the consideration that alienation was a possibility. And so it's like, the court has to make a quick decision. They maybe have 3,000 cases a year to handle. And so they're quickly on to, the first person that says what the problem is, that's the problem I'm going to address. Oh, now I get it. This is a case of abuse. So what really needs to happen is there needs to be 3 theories of any high conflict case. And if you're a parent or a professional listening to this, you need to put that forward, I believe, to the court if you're in family court and say, I understand that the court has to consider 3 possibilities when one person makes an allegation that the other is acting very badly. So one is maybe there is child abuse, sexual child abuse, domestic violence, estrangement, substance abuse, that's a problem. And you have to consider the possibility that that's true, and you have to look into that. But equally, you have to consider that it's not true at all, that the person who's making this allegation against the other person may be the one who's acting badly. And that this could be alienation, this could be false allegations, and maybe even that parent is abusive or projecting their behavior onto the other parent. But you also have to equally consider that both parents are acting badly, and it's pretty much equal. Now, what I have to tell you is judges tend to have a preference for one of these theories in many cases, especially the ones that don't go well. And I have to tell you, I teach judges. Judges are great people. They're sincere people. They're smart people. But many of them don't know family law, and many of them don't understand family dynamics. And so unless they're familiar with child abuse, domestic violence, alienation, substance abuse, all of those possibilities, they may jump to the conclusion that this is what they know. And so if this is a case where someone says it's child abuse, physical child abuse, then the judge might go, oh, okay, well, now I know what to do. I've got to order, getting some new skills for that. So they stop, because physical child abuse is fairly easy to stop and train parents to not engage in that. It's a lot of different programs that are good at that. So, but if the judge isn't familiar with alienation, they don't even think about it. And so you have to say, this is a possibility that you have to equally consider. Now, today, I'm also starting to see cases where judges do know about alienation, and alienation is how the case is first presented, but it's actually estrangement. It's actually the other parent has done something that's pushing the child away from them. They may be too emotionally intense, or maybe they have been abusive. And so that has to be considered too. So one of my goals is for family courts to really adopt this 3 theories of the high conflict case approach, including alienation as one of the possibilities. So that's what should be happening. Now, let's talk a little more about the science of this. When I was starting to deal with those child sexual abuse cases, some true, more not true, and many of them alienation cases in the 1990s, this book, Jeopardy in the Courtroom, came out, and it was published by the American Psychological Association, and it talked about how to do interviews correctly and not to do them incorrectly. And this book was part of getting those child care center workers released from their 40-year prison sentences, because they were based completely on confirmation bias in child interviews. So the book talks a lot about interviewer bias, and that helps understand confirmation bias, because the interviewer that has the one theory. So I'm going to read this from the slide because I want it to get through to people. So interviewer bias characterizes those interviews where interviewers have a priori beliefs. In other words, they've jumped to a conclusion already about the occurrence of certain events, and as a result, mold the interview to elicit statements from the interviewee, think of like a 5-year-old child, that are consistent with these prior beliefs. One of the hallmarks of interviewer bias is the single-minded attempt to gather only confirmatory evidence and to avoid all avenues that may produce negative or inconsistent evidence. Thus, while gathering evidence to support his hypothesis, that's his theory of the case, an interviewer may fail to gather any evidence that could potentially disconfirm his hypothesis. In other words, show that his theory isn't accurate. And this is a scientific principle. Scientific researchers have to look at, when they're trying to see, is something true, they have to consider and look at, is this false? They have to examine that possibility. Now, here I'm talking about an interviewer, but just picture a judge. A judge takes testimony, family court judge may ask questions. And in many cases, family court judges are following the same idea of a criminal court, which is what's being said about this person true or false? But there's only one theory that they're looking at is true or false. Is this child abuse or is this not child abuse? They don't go to the next question is, if it's not child abuse, what is it? They just go, oh, it's not child abuse, let's move on. And I've had many cases like that. And so let's talk a little further about interviewers. So interviewers should follow the same principles as scientific investigators. They should arrive at the truth by ruling out rival hypotheses, in other words, other possible theories, particularly the most reasonable rivals, such as alienation in a case that originally was thought to be child abuse. And by attempting to falsify their favored hypothesis, such as child abuse. So in scientific terms, you falsify a hypothesis by looking at its opposite. So you try to see, is there reasons this isn't child abuse? So rather than, is this child abuse, is there enough evidence? It's, is this child abuse, or equally, is this not child abuse? In which case, let's look at alienation. So this is what scientists mean when they endorse proof by disproof as the best means of ascertaining the truth. And that's what we want. That's what everyone wants. That's what judges want. They want to know the truth. But most family law professionals, lawyers, therapists, mediators, judges, are not familiar with the concept of confirmation bias. And that's why it's so important, if you're a parent or if you're a lawyer presenting in court, that you present this possibility and the three theories of the case that all have to equally be considered to be sure you're getting at the truth, and not concerned about, who you like or who sounds the most reasonable. Sometimes the person that's not sounding reasonable is actually more accurate. And we know with high conflict people, which I talk a lot about in these webinars for family access, that high conflict people can be very persuasive blamers and make people think what they're saying is true. But a good court hearing will give people the feeling that all possibilities have been examined, and here is the judge's conclusion based on looking seriously at all of these possibilities. And it's easier for parents to accept that, knowing that their point of view is being considered. So I want to talk about one parent in the spotlight. That tends to be the way that family courts work. And it surprises people. So what seems to happen is the first explanation of a problem, and I've seen this many times, a high conflict parent goes to court to early get an emergency order. And sometimes those are needed, protect people from domestic violence, child abuse, etc. But sometimes those are false. I've had false allegations of domestic violence. A case where a woman went to court and claimed that the husband had been violent with her, gave a list of detailed behaviors for a week. And the judge, gave her restraining order. And the husband was not there because it was an emergency hearing without notice, which is possible in emergency situations. And so she got her restraining order, which included a kick out of the home order. Well, it turns out when there's the follow-up hearing that the father goes to court and brings the plane tickets showing that he was out of the state when that was happening, and that this was totally false allegations. And so the definition of the case is often made at that first hearing. And so the judge is like, this is a domestic violence case, when in that case, it wasn't. It was a false allegations and eventually alienation case. And so you can see how the information you get can influence your view of the case. So that's just one example. But when a judge hears someone say the other person's acting badly and here's how they're acting badly, the judge often then proceeds with the idea that this is or isn't what's happening, and that's all they focus on. So one parent is in the spotlight. So in that case, dad was in the spotlight. He was abusive to mom, and yet he convinced the court that it was a false allegation. And so the court says, okay, so the restraining order, the husband said, I'll stay out of the house, but I don't need a restraining order. The court vacated the restraining order. But that's the only definition of the case, an only person in the spotlight. The spotlight took a while to shift to the mom, the wife, as someone who makes numerous false allegations, which she did. She eventually got sanctioned for making false allegations. But courts tend to just have one spotlight. And it's important to know that as a parent and as professionals, especially new lawyers, is they approach it like a criminal case. It's guilty or not guilty, rather than, hey, there's another theory. You have to consider this theory. Families have more than one person that could be potentially causing trouble. So the judge pursues the question of whether the person's guilty or not, and doesn't consider these alternative hypotheses or theories or possibilities. And I've had cases where, like false allegation of child sexual abuse, and the judge has said, well, one case, the dad said the mom sexually abused the child, the boy. And after a bunch of, those allegations get examined, it's like, no, that didn't happen. But there was still something the judge criticized the mom for. So, well, you still, you shouldn't have gotten into such and such situation. Rather than going, now let's look at dad. What's dad doing? Is this a case of false allegations and alienation? They just stop with the first investigation, the first spotlight, the first person that makes a claim of abuse is often the person who defines the whole case. So you be careful that you present the idea of you got to consider three theories, otherwise it's confirmation bias. So just in winding down this short presentation, because I'm a social worker as well as a lawyer, I'm very involved in cases of true and false allegations, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, alienation, and there are false allegations of alienation cases that are really estrangement. So you still have to keep looking at the case and getting professionals to look, because it hurts understanding of alienation if advocates for alienation and helping people see that don't recognize that there are some false allegations of alienation, say against a mom, saying, you're alienating the child when the child's resistance to dad is because of dad's behavior. So in all cases, we should really look at these three theories. But I want to talk briefly in child sexual abuse cases. There's really at least 5 possibilities. And I've had all of these possibilities where there was child sexual abuse throughout the marriage and it came out at the time of separation. I've had cases where this child sexual abuse happened after the separation, because without the other parent around, it was kind of a break on that kind of behavior, and that's been revealed. I've had cases of reports that were honestly believed but false. So I had a client who, a child come back sad after a weekend with dad and go, oh, he must have hurt her. And this is a parent with a very histrionic personality, probably personality disorder. And she just saw things through the worst light. And so accused dad. That was a case the court figured out. And no, this isn't child sexual abuse. And I think went to 50-50 parenting time. And eventually she may have lost her 50% because she kept pursuing something a psychologist had evaluated, a very wise judge had understood, all of that. Then there's false reports that are knowingly false. Had a case like that I mentioned before, mom against dad, saying that he sexually abused 8-year-old daughter. It became very clear that this was not true, that she had actually threatened the daughter to say things, and it was knowingly false, and she was sanctioned by the court for the costs, for some of the costs, and frankly, not most of the costs of her false allegation. In that case, she lost her contact with the child except for an hour a week in a therapist's office as a transition to supervise what she was saying to the child. She was saying a lot of alienating things, as well as bringing terrible false allegations. And she didn't go to the therapist's office with the child. She refused to do that. She said, I'm not going to do that. So that was that case. And also sometimes it's somebody else. So 3 or 4-year-old kids say, you know, Joe touched me, and Joe works, you know, at a child care center. They go, oh, Joe's in trouble. Turns out there's a guy at the park named Joe that did this, and not the child care worker. So those are possibilities. And if alienation isn't considered equally, that's confirmation bias. Now, like I said, there's true child sexual abuse and it's underreported. So this is not to say that doesn't exist. This is to say that sometimes it's really child alienation. And by the way, allegations of child sexual abuse in family court only occur about 2 or 3% of divorce cases, whereas alienations, you know, between 10 and 15% at least. So the alienation is much more common. Last one I want to talk about is domestic violence, because sometimes a child doesn't want to be around a parent who's been violent with the other parent. Domestic violence exists. Probably majority of domestic violence allegations are true, and have to be taken seriously. And maybe 50% of court divorce cases have domestic violence allegations. And let's say, you know, majority of those are true. Maybe 10% aren't, maybe 15% aren't. I've had some of those cases. But the court has to consider all these possibilities. There's 4 types of domestic violence: coercive control, where one person's really dominating the other person; violent resistance, someone resists that coercive control; situational couple violence, where both people are pushing and shoving; and separation, where there's no pattern or history, but there's an incident or two at separation. And those should each be handled a little differently. This isn't a seminar on that. There's also false allegations. Sometimes honestly believe. Someone's like, oh, you know, comments and this and that, I feel so threatened, when it's really that person's personality and it's not true. And objectively, you figure that out. But they could get a child to resist seeing a parent that they fear because of their own emotional fears in life. Like people with personality disorders feel like they're victims in life. And in that situation, there could be false allegations that influence a child to resist a parent. And the other is knowingly false. And maybe they're trying to get something, get a financial gain, get control of the kids. Like that example I gave where the mom said the dad was violent and he had been on an out-of-state trip when she made up all her allegations, which I think she got probably from somebody else's court file. So in short, there's a lot of information available about all of this. I've got a lot of books. Don't Alienate the Kids is the one that most addresses what we're talking about. But the others for lawyers, High Conflict People and Legal Disputes, True and False Cases. And to overcome this, and if you're communicating, use BIF for co-parent communication, and mediating, calming with ear statements, and the book Splitting. Splitting talks also about alienation and abuse and trying to figure it out. Anyway, that's enough for now. And best wishes, and I hope that these thoughts are helpful to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Smith. I am a family law attorney in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And on October 13th through the 15th, I'll be participating and speaking at the conference Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and the Abuse. I hope you'll join me. I'm going to be talking about parental alienation and the fact that there's plenty of blame to go around as it relates to the issue. As we all know, parental alienation is a known tactic used by family law litigants to gain leverage in custody cases. However, a parent can only alienate as much as the family law system will let them. Judges, attorneys, psychologists, therapists, CPS workers, everyone in this entire system plays a role in every case and every alienation case, especially. So I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about how the system allows for the unjustifiable division in distance of children from the target parent. What can we do as an industry to better safeguard against it? I'm very excited about this topic because I think it's one that doesn't get talked about enough. It's one that sometimes gets lost in the noise. There's a lot of conversations around the fact that targeted parents are, the victims. There's a lot of noise regarding the alienating parent. There's a lot of noise regarding the argument as to whether parental alienation is real or not, and whether it's pseudoscience or not. I really want to talk about how the system that we are working in and is contributing to the alienation of children from their parents and the systemic issues within our family law court system that we need to be addressing. I want to talk about what those are. I want to talk about how we can counteract those issues and maybe some tips and ways to try to avoid the pitfalls that can sometimes result in alienation that doesn't have to occur. For example, if you are a parent who is not getting an opportunity to see your child, are you making sure that you're doing everything you can to try to get back in front of a judge as soon as you can? Or are you allowing time to go by that you don't need to? There are some specific things I think we can all do as attorneys. We can do them as guardian ad litems. We can do it as mental health professionals to help try to avoid unnecessary distance between parents and children during the process. I want to talk about how we can counteract those things, as well as any potential policy changes we might want to be talking about to safeguard against alienation by the court itself. I'm really excited about this. I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll join us during this conference, again, October 13th through the 15th. Alienation, the truth regarding the trauma and the abuse. Join me as we talk about where we can point a little bit of blame beyond the alienating parent in this systemic issue. Hope you'll join me.
On our next episode of Families Divided TV, Christy Lever speaks on mitigating the risks of parental alienation.